Hey everyone, welcome. As an enthusiastic biblical researcher, I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through this robust 1,500-word study into one of the most complex and honestly most debated eschatological theories out there. Now, for anyone needing a quick refresher, eschatology simply means the theology of the end times. Specifically, we're looking at the ultimate question of if and when the rapture of the church might actually occur. Scholars and theologians have gone back and forth on this for literally centuries. But today, we're going to look at some deeply fascinating scriptural clues, ancient historical traditions, and some wild prophetic mathematics that all attempt to piece together this massive prophetic puzzle. Ever wonder why certain biblical phrases are repeated so often, or what they actually mean for us today? Well, that is exactly what we are going to uncover.
Now, I want to explicitly state right up front that this entire study is impartially derived from a really deep dive presentation by YouTube creator Robert Breaker. I need to be super clear here. We are not setting definitive dates today, and we're not taking sides or endorsing specific timelines. Rather, we are objectively looking at his unique methodology. It's just incredibly interesting to see the scriptural connections he draws across thousands of years of text. A link to his original source video is right down there in the description below, so you definitely can, and absolutely should, check out his full presentation for yourself.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our research roadmap for today's study. We're going to start with the rapture premise, look at Galilean wedding customs, break down some prophetic mathematical timelines, explore the typology of the 7 feasts, examine some fascinating modern signs involving trumpets and red heifers, and finally, we'll wrap up with the biblical command of watching and waiting.
Number 1. The rapture premise, the Great Escape. Right, so before we can even begin to look at a timeline, we have to establish the theological foundation of a pre-tribulation rapture. This is basically the belief that believers are going to be taken up to heaven before the 7 prophesied years of global end times judgment. Now, you'll often hear critics claim that the whole concept of a pre-tribulation escape was just, invented out of thin air in the 1800s by a guy named John Nelson Darby. But Breaker's presentation completely counters this by looking much further back into history and scripture. The study points right to Titus 2:13, which talks about looking for that blessed hope. And the analysis here is just highly logical. Think about it. If believers had to suffer through the horrors of the 7-year tribulation, facing the literal wrath of the Antichrist and the global mark of the beast, well, that wouldn't exactly be a blessed hope, would it? The true hope, Breaker argues, is a great escape, an evacuation of believers before all that divine wrath is poured out onto the earth. To really validate this premise, the study maps out some very specific clues to show a long-standing historical precedent. First up, the source brings in researchers who found writings from the early church fathers. We're talking about men living just hundreds of years after Christ, and they were openly discussing a pre-tribulation escape. So that clearly proves the idea heavily predates Darby's 1800s teachings. Secondly, let's look at the grammar. When the Apostle Paul writes about the rapture in 1 Thessalonians 4, he uses the very specific pronoun we. He says, "we which are alive and remain." Breaker observes that Paul wouldn't use we unless he genuinely believed this event could happen in his very own lifetime. And finally, the logic here zeroes in on Jesus' famous promise to go and prepare mansions in heaven for his followers. The presentation reasons that logically, Christ wouldn't build these massive, magnificent heavenly homes just to leave them totally empty while he returns to live on a ruined earth, right? The underlying thought is that he has to come take his bride, the church, to those mansions first.
Now, as any good researcher knows, you absolutely have to address the counter-arguments. You can't ignore them. And the biggest, most common pushback to studying any end times timeline is Matthew 24:36, where Jesus says, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man." So what do we do with that? Well, the presentation offers a brilliant counterpoint about context. When Jesus actually spoke those words, he was physically here on earth, operating in his earthly ministry, limiting himself in certain ways. Jesus explicitly added, "but my Father only." So, okay, while no man on earth knew the exact timing, the Father in heaven absolutely did know it. And the source asks a really provocative question here. After Jesus ascended to heaven and took his seat at the right hand of the Father in all his glory, do we seriously think the Father kept that secret from the Son for the next 2,000 years? Especially when we know for a fact God later gave Jesus the entire book of Revelation to specifically share with the church? It's definitely food for thought. Section 2. Galilean wedding customs, the ancient blueprint. To really get what that famous phrase, "no man knows the day or the hour" means, we actually need to put on our historical glasses and look through a cultural lens. The study suggests that this idiom isn't just a random phrase. It's deeply rooted in ancient Galilean marriage traditions. And this brilliantly illustrates the biblical concept of the rapture. In ancient Galilee, a marriage proposal physically involved offering the bride a glass of wine. If she drank it, Boom, she accepted the covenant. That's a remarkably clear parallel to believers accepting Christ's blood, right? Then, the groom would physically leave his bride to go build an addition onto his father's house for them to live in. But here is the absolutely crucial key. The groom didn't get to decide when the house was done. Nope. Only the groom's father had the ultimate authority to declare, okay, the house is finished, the wedding can happen. It was this fiercely guarded family secret, and when the father finally gave the green light, the groom would take off running to the bride's house with a sudden shout, usually surprising her completely in the dead of night. The presentation beautifully maps this vivid, real-world historical custom directly to God the Father holding the secret date of the wedding, just waiting for the absolute perfect moment to send his son with a shout to gather his bride. Section 3. Prophetic Mathematical Timelines, the 2,000-year clue.
All right, having established that cultural and scriptural groundwork, we're now going to shift our study over to a highly analytical lens. We're getting into prophetic mathematics. Over in 2 Peter 3:8, we are given a very distinct, very clear mathematical formula. A day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. The presentation takes this divine cipher and applies it directly to a mysterious little prophecy tucked away in Hosea 6:2. That passage states that Israel will be revived after 2 days, and on the 3rd day they will be raised up to live in his sight. So if we use our mathematical framework, those 2 prophetic days represent 2,000 literal years. The source material argues that God operates on a very strict, specific mathematical timeline, and by applying Peter's cipher to Hosea's prophecy, this fascinating chronological picture starts to emerge for us researchers to analyze.
Let's move to the whiteboard here and see how this builds into an incredible mathematical timeline. If Christ died and rose in roughly 33 AD, and we add those 2 prophetic days from Hosea, which, using our cipher, equals 2,000 literal years, we land right at the year 2033 AD. This year marks the potential start of the millennial kingdom. That's the prophesied 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, that 3rd day mentioned where they live in his sight. But hold on, remember our earlier foundation? Before the millennium can start, we have to get through the terrible 7-year tribulation. So if you take 2033 and subtract those 7 years of tribulation, mathematically, you land right on 2026 AD as a potential timeline for the rapture of the church. Now, let me pause as a researcher here. I'm presenting this strictly to show how cleanly the math maps out on paper. Neither we nor the source material are endorsing this as an absolute dogmatic certainty. But wow, it certainly makes you think about how incredibly close these prophetic benchmarks might be to our modern era, doesn't it?
Moving on to section 4, the 7 feasts, a celestial calendar.
Now we're going to introduce the typological lens of the study. Typology is basically how historical symbols and events intentionally foreshadow future realities. So God gave the ancient nation of Israel 7 specific feasts to observe. The source analyzes these not just as, ancient agricultural holidays or people got together, but as a literal celestial calendar, a divine step-by-step blueprint outlining the exact timeline of the Messiah's mission. Breaker's presentation points out a remarkably clear division here. The first 4 are the spring feasts: Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and Pentecost. The final 3 are the fall feasts: trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles. The fascinating reality brought up by this study is that those spring feasts perfectly, and I mean chronologically perfectly, aligned with Christ's first coming on earth. They have all been completely fulfilled, which naturally leaves the fall feasts totally unfulfilled, acting as these massive remaining blueprints for the end times. Just to quickly illustrate how precise this prophetic pattern is, the source material breaks down exactly how Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of those spring feasts. On the very day of Passover, Jesus died as the ultimate spotless sacrifice, the Lamb. During the Feast of Unleavened Bread, his sinless, unleavened body was placed in the grave, seeing no corruption. On the exact day of first fruits, he victoriously resurrected from the dead as the first fruits of them that slept. And exactly 50 days later, right on the Feast of Pentecost, he ascended to heaven in a cloud. I mean, the chronological accuracy here between the ancient Jewish calendar and the historical, documented events of Christ's life is just absolutely staggering. And seeing how perfectly God fulfilled those first 4 naturally forces us as researchers to ask, okay, how exactly will the 3 unfulfilled fall feasts play out on the global stage? Section 5, Trumpets and Red Heifers, Modern Signs. This brings us right to the climax of our study, where we look at these unfulfilled fall feasts and how Breaker ties them to highly specific, ongoing global events happening literally today. The very next feast up on God's prophetic calendar is the Feast of Trumpets. During this specific feast, ancient Jewish tradition dictates that a shofar, which is an instrument made from a ram's horn, is blown precisely 100 times. That final 100th blast, it is specifically, historically called the last trump. Now that deeply, undeniably echoes the Apostle Paul's writing that the rapture happens at the last trump.
But wait, it gets better. Because this specific feast was uniquely dictated by the exact sighting of the new moon by two designated witnesses, it was historically referred to by the Jews as the feast where no man knows the day or the hour. That is the exact phrase Jesus used. The study even points out this eerie historical coincidence, noting that on modern calendars, this feast sometimes aligns right around September 11th, an observation that draws a really undeniable parallel to America's history and its upcoming 250th anniversary.
Following the Feast of Trumpets is the Feast of Atonement. And regarding this specific feast, the study presents a truly surprising modern fact for you to chew on. According to first-hand research in Israel that's highlighted in the presentation, there are currently 5 completely unblemished, cloned red heifers sitting securely in Israel right today. And what is just wild is that they were actually imported all the way from the state of Texas. I mean, historically, finding even one completely unblemished red heifer is incredibly rare, let alone 5 of them. So why do these 5 specific Texas cows matter so much to this study? Because according to strict Old Testament law found in Numbers 19, the ashes of a flawless red heifer are absolutely 100% required for ceremonial purification before the Feast of Atonement can officially resume. For nearly 2,000 years, Orthodox Jews simply haven't had them. Now, suddenly, they do. The source notes that the Temple Institute in Jerusalem literally has every other element ready to go to rebuild the Third Temple. The architectural stones are numbered and ready. The intricate high priest garments are already woven. Literally, only the historical and highly contested structure known as the Dome of the Rock stands physically in the way of construction. For researchers who study these distinct biblical timelines, this modern state of readiness signifies that the tribulation timeline is perfectly staged to commence, a timeline where eventually the Antichrist is prophesied to desecrate this very temple halfway through the 7-year period. The presentation even shared a fun little moment where an audience member pointed out a linguistic coincidence regarding the Feast of Trumpets, noting that the name of a recent U.S. president is literally Trump, and pondering if that somehow linguistically ties into the whole last Trump era. Again, this is just a neutral observation presented in the study, but you have to admit, it is undeniably fascinating to document all these pieces coming together. Finally, Section 6. Watching and waiting, the final pieces. All right, we're moving into the conclusion of our study now. While the mathematical dates, the ancient agricultural feasts, and those modern Texas red heifers are deeply captivating to piece together, the primary instruction we get from the source material is one of vigilance. So the crucial point is found right here in Revelation 3:3. If therefore thou shalt not watch, I will come on thee as a thief, and thou shalt not know what hour I will come upon thee. Ricker's logic here is simple, but it is profoundly important. If not watching means you won't know the hour, the inverse implication is that if you are watching the scriptural clues, you just might recognize the season of his return. So what does this actually mean for your daily life? Well, the command isn't to set a dogmatic date, quit your job, and just stop living. Not at all. The command is to stay spiritually awake, pay close attention to the world around you, and keep looking up. As we wrap up this study into Robert Breaker's incredibly fascinating eschatological framework, we're really left to step back and ponder all these overlapping clues as one massive, beautiful tapestry. We've got the 2,000-year prophetic mathematics, the stunning precision of the ancient Galilean wedding customs, the looming unfulfilled fall feasts, and those highly specific red heifers waiting in Israel at this very moment. It really makes you wonder, are we actually witnessing the real-time unfolding of an ancient celestial calendar right in our very lifetime? Or are these just complex, coincidental historical echoes? Ultimately, the answer is up to you to research and decide. I encourage you to keep studying the scriptures, keep watching the signs, and thank you so much for hanging out and joining me on this deep dive into the prophetic puzzle. See you next time.